Today, we are diving into a really thought-provoking analysis from Lawson Akigbe over at the Center for Nigeria Progress. It's called The Republic on Mute. And what we're doing is unpacking his fascinating observations on systemic drift in American politics. We'll be looking closely at how the traditional bedrock pillars of democratic accountability might actually be, well, quietly shifting right under our feet. To really hook us into this concept, the author starts off with this incredibly striking paradox. I mean, think about this for a second. Why is a hereditary monarch lecturing a republic on its constitution? Akigbe points to the recent visit of King Charles III to the U.S. Congress. He highlights the profound irony here. You've got a monarch addressing the elected representatives of a republic literally born out of rebellion against the monarchy, and he's implicitly urging them to uphold their own constitutional principles. It's a moment that, if you read it in a political thriller, you'd probably roll your eyes and say it's too heavy-handed, but it actually happened, and it perfectly sets the stage for this massive paradox of modern American governance that we are about to explore. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is how we'll break down America's democratic pillars today. First, a republic on mute. Second, testing constitutional boundaries. Third, the absent legislature. Fourth, failing institutional guardrails. And finally, the quiet decay. Let's jump right in. Section 1. A republic on mute. Diagnosing the system. So the entire foundation of Akigbe's analysis really rests on this brilliant concept he calls institutional drowsiness. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a systemic lapse where each arm of government basically just assumes the other is going to do all the heavy lifting. The author makes the case that America's current challenges aren't just one-off policy failures. Instead, we're witnessing this procedural sophistication that hides a deep systemic lethargy. I mean, what actually happens when every single branch of government simultaneously decides to take a nap, just fully expecting the others to handle the constitutional friction? That exact question is the lens we're going to use to examine all these institutions today. Moving right along to Section 2, testing constitutional boundaries. We're focusing specifically on the executive branch here. And this brilliantly illustrates that dynamic of institutional drowsiness in action. Akigbe looks at how recent administrations, including Donald Trump's, have really tested the elasticity of constitutional boundaries. Let's look at the War Powers Resolution. Now, born out of the Vietnam War, its 60-day clock was supposed to be a strict, binding constraint on unilateral military action. It was a hard rule. Yet when we look at modern conflicts, like those involving Iran, for instance, the source notes that this once strict deadline is essentially treated as a polite suggestion. It's a massive bipartisan stress test of the Constitution. But the analysis doesn't stop at just military powers, right? It extends into the broader political culture itself. The author observes how the executive branch navigates modern media. For example, he points out Donald Trump's insistence on his quote-unquote genius performance in cognitive assessments. Now, the critical takeaway here isn't some partisan attack. It's actually a neutral observation of how the system as a whole responds. In a previous era, claims like that would be aggressively, relentlessly interrogated. Today, they just sort of get absorbed into the news cycle as this curious little sideshow. We have a culture that increasingly rewards the performance of leadership way more than the precision of leadership. The facts might get checked, sure, but that larger entertaining narrative arc, it almost never gets disrupted. So how exactly does the legislative branch respond to this kind of executive push? Let's get into Section 3, the absent legislature, or Congress's diminishing appetite. Congress is theoretically supposed to be the absolute first line of defense against executive overreach. But Akigbe diagnoses them with a diminishing appetite for institutional self-respect. They are literally ceding deeply consequential war-making powers just through sheer inertia. We see literal absence. Key national debates are unfolding in these half-filled chambers where achieving a quorum feels more like an optional aesthetic choice than a democratic necessity. And when they finally do hold oversight hearings, the analysis points out that they tend to generate quick soundbites for television rather than engaging in any real substantive scrutiny. They're essentially performing the act of oversight without actually exercising it. All right, Section 4, failing institutional guardrails. If the legislature is essentially absent, what's happening with the courts and the media? So the crucial point here is how these two institutions react. When we look at the judiciary, the author describes their action as cautious adjudication. Courts, by their nature, lean toward incrementalism. But when the political branches are out there actively testing the boundaries, this extreme caution results in permissive ambiguity. The courts basically fail to establish firm guardrails. And then you have the press, the unofficial enforcement arm of democracy. Akibe notes their uneven performance. You see it all the time. A really probing question gets asked, a partial, totally evasive answer is given, and the reporter just moves on to the next topic. The ultimate results of that? Completely diluted accountability. I really want to pause on this specific, incredibly powerful assertion from the text regarding the judiciary. Silence is not neutrality. It is permissive ambiguity. This matters so much for anyone trying to wrap their head around constitutional law. When the courts hesitate to clarify the absolute outer limits of power, their lack of action isn't just some neutral stance keeping them above the political fray. Not at all. By refusing to define the boundary, they are actively permitting that boundary to be stretched. They are quite literally giving permission through their silence. And that brings us to our final section today. Section 5, the quiet decay, the anatomy of apathy. What is the ultimate result when the entire constitutional system simply drifts? Akibe argues that the American system was specifically, intentionally designed to contest power, to ensure that ambition counteracts ambition, right? But when that contest weakens, we're left with this very distinct anatomy of apathy. A presidency that pushes the boundaries, a Congress that merely shrugs in response, a judiciary that hesitates to step in, and a press that occasionally blinks when it should be staring down evasions. The source insists that this isn't some dramatic, sudden death of a democracy. It's actually a gradual, subtle accommodation to lowered expectations. And honestly, that subtle accommodation might be far more dangerous. The author captures this whole sentiment with just an absolutely brilliant quote. In constitutional democracies, decay rarely announces itself with a bang. If there is one thing I want you to take away from this explainer today, it's that line. If you are sitting around waiting for a fiery explosion or some singular catastrophic event to signal the unraveling of accountability, you are looking in the completely wrong place. The system doesn't break all at once. And what's really interesting is how Akibe completes that thought. He says more often it arrives as a series of shrugged shoulders. It is such a profound metaphor. It's the missed deadline on the War Powers Act. It's the completely empty seats in the legislative chamber. It's that unanswered follow-up question in the White House press briefing room. It's just the steady accumulation of 1,000 tiny concessions where institutions collectively decide it's simply too much effort to push back. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative question from the source text. The author is very clear on this point. The system absolutely still has the capacity to correct itself. But, as we know, capacity is definitely not the same thing as willpower. So, does the political will exist to correct this institutional drowsiness before these temporary deviations calcify into permanent practice? Are we watching a temporary lapse, or are we looking at the new normal? It's a vital, absolutely critical question to keep in mind as you watch the daily news cycle unfold. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those hard questions, and I'll catch you next time.